As an adolescent in suburban Boston, Roger Francis was tormented by a fear of rejection. He pegged it to the death of his father when he was 8. The major problem was my feeling of persecution, that I was cursed, that I couldn't do anything right, he told the Boston Globe. I looked on the black side. In 1962, the 15-year-old Francis went off the rails when he was spurned in a puppy love crush on a girl who didn't seem to return my affection. Francis scrawled a rant threatening to kill her, and the teen spent the next several years in reformatories and mental hospitals. A psychiatrist judged him both homicidal and suicidal, very disturbed and dangerous. Presciently, the shrink concluded, he handles this frustration around this unobtainable girl by having fantasies of destroying her. At Christmas time in 1966, another unsuspecting girl, Mary Alice Pike from Rockland, Mass., walked into the web of Francis' anxieties. They dated for a few months before Pike, 15, decided to disentangle from her troubled suitor, who was by then a 20-year-old man. He wasn't having it. On March 11, 1967, Francis convinced the girl to join him for one last dinner at the Newton, Mass. home he shared with his mother. The next morning, a state trooper stopped to inspect what he thought was a pile of discarded clothing in the median of busy Route 3 in Hingham, near Rockland. It was Mary Alice Pike, shot 6 times with a .22 and barely breathing. Police issued an alarm for Francis, whose blood-stained car was soon found abandoned 350 miles north of Boston in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. A week after the shooting, Francis surrendered to an Episcopal priest in a hotel lobby in St. John, New Brunswick. Hingham Police Chief Raymond Campbell flew to Canada to fetch him. "I've been expecting you fellows," Francis quipped. He asked whether Pike was alive, and Raymond informed him that she had died the day before, without regaining consciousness. "Will I get the chair?" the killer asked. That question hung over his trial, held 50 years ago in Plymouth, Mass. Francis claimed insanity, and 3 medical witnesses, 2 for the defense, 1 for the prosecution, testified about his history of mental illness. Each said he was a paranoid schizophrenic with homicidal tendencies. In his own testimony, Francis acknowledged the murder but said he felt disembodied from the crime, like watching a movie. "I'm sorry this had to happen," he said. "I do not know why it happened. I still feel I love Mary Alice." He begged jurors to allow him to live with you, my friends and all others. Morrigan Getty Images a stock photo, but they rejected insanity and convicted Francis of first-degree murder while recommending against capital punishment. Not a surprise, since Massachusetts' last execution was in 1947. On November 3, 1967, the trial judge sentenced Francis to life in prison. He bellowed, he'd rather have the death penalty, but his long, strange trip through the legal system was just getting started. 14 months later, Francis swallowed a fistful of smuggled tranquilizers after his initial appeal was rejected by the state Supreme Court. His attorney said suicide was inevitable. "We cried wolf for almost 2 years, but nobody believed us," said Alfred Nugent. Roger is a very sick boy. Francis spent most of the next 2 decades at Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane while his endless salvo of appeals crawled through court dockets. Francis struck gold in 1989, when a judge granted him a new trial on a technicality. The dead girl's loved ones were stunned when he was freed on bail in 1990. "It's a bunch of hogwash," said Mary Alice's father, John Pike. "Everything is stacked against us." And it only got worse for the Pikes. A new defense attorney, Charles Rankin, worked out a sweet plea deal in 1994 to allow Francis to admit to second-degree murder. He would then become immediately eligible to apply for parole based on his 22 years of confinement. Prosecutors agreed not to oppose his release. A kink cropped up when prison officials said Francis, who was still out on bail, had to be behind bars to apply for parole. He was mortified about returning to prison even briefly, so for years his attorney slow-played the case as Francis lived like a free man. In 2000, prosecutors finally forced Francis to choose between the plea deal and a first-degree murder retrial. He took a gamble on a retrial in 2003 and lost. He was convicted again of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The saga took another turn in 2013, when Superior Court Justice Linda Giles tried to retroactively enforce the 1994 plea bargain that would have freed Francis, citing principles of fundamental fairness. In August this year, the state's High Court ruled that Giles had abused her discretion in trying to restore the deal. A judge may not use the vantage point of hindsight to second-guess the decision of a defendant in rejecting a plea agreement, the court said. The Quincy Patriot-Ledger called the ruling Francis' final chance of seeing daylight. But further appeals seem certain. Francis, now 70, proved a half-century ago that he doesn't stand for rejection.